Good afternoon. On behalf of Department of English, MSCB University Kyongja Campus, Odisha, I welcome our viewers to our special online lecture titled Reading with the Dutts, Toru Dutts and the Practice of Leisurely Reading. We are honored and delighted to have as our speaker Dr. Swati Moitra. Dr. Moitra has an MPhil and PhD. She is currently working as assistant professor at the Department of English, Guru Das College, University of Calcutta. She has earlier taught at Shivaji College and Miranda House, Delhi University. Her areas of interest include book history and histories of readership. She will be presenting some of her recent work on Toru Dutts. I would like to welcome Dr. Moitra. But before we begin, we take a moment to remember Professor Swapan Chakravarti, one of India's preeminent book historians, who unfortunately passed away a couple of days ago. This is a talk on book history. Professor Chakravarti's work, his 4 volumes on book history in India, which he has co-edited with Professor Avijit Gupta, and several others, his works have inspired many students, many scholars, and will continue to do so. This is informed. May I now request Dr. Moitra to please begin her presentation. Her talk will be followed by question and answers. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Moitra.
Thank you so much, Shashwat. I hope I'm audible. Also, I apologize in advance for the cat interruptions. My cat gets very worked up when I get here. I'm really sorry. He will probably disrupt us a couple of more times. He does not appreciate book history at all. Um, Again, I'm very thankful to Shashwat for this invitation, for the Department of English, and for the university and the students for being here. Um, I'm Again, it is a deeply tragic matter that Professor Shopan Chakraborty passed away so soon. His work has been a matter of inspiration for many of us, even those of us who were never his direct students, so to speak. I know him through his work, and that is how perhaps there can be no better homage to him than to continue reading his work and engaging with his work. And with that in mind, I'll start sharing my screen, though it's not really a video heavy, a heavy presentation as such. So I hope this is visible. I'll start speaking now. So in this paper, I'm going to talk about the following things. I'm going to talk about the material practice of buying books and collecting books in 19th century Calcutta, especially in terms of its networks of distribution and the meaning it held for elite Bengali households at the time, as the Dutts were. I'm going to talk about reading for leisure, in particular as practiced by the Dutts, and engage with the larger question of leisurely reading among Bengali women that, at the time, led to howls of outrage and hyperbolic narratives about chaos and destruction of the Bengali household and the caste Hindu society at large. Pursuing these strands of thought through Torudat's letters, I will show, and I will show that it offers us a unique picture of book ownership among the Bengali elite in 19th century Calcutta. It offers us, furthermore, insights into the poet herself as an avid and an eclectic reader. Before I start, of course, let me introduce you to the Dramatis Personae. Not that you're unfamiliar, especially students of literature do know Toru Dutt. On your left is Toru Dutt. On your right is a portrait of Toru with her elder sister Oru Dutt, who would pass away from tuberculosis a couple of years ago before Toru would also follow suit. This is on the left is again Govind Chandra Dutt, her father, and a very important and influential figure in terms of her inner in her reading habits and her practices. And on the right, her mother. And last but not the least is this is Miss Mary Martin, the friend to whom she writes these letters in England. Uh, so, with this cast of characters in mind, we go a little bit ahead and to the backdrop uh, to this entire narrative. And I'll begin with an advertisement in the Calcutta Gazette, dated 7th October 1784, which advertises an elegant collection lately arrived from London, including rum from Jamaica, gin from Netherlands, cognac brandy, English linens, a wide variety of hats, including riding hats for ladies, fashionable gold-plated walking sticks, boxes, desks, trunks, mattresses, optical and mathematical instruments, musical instruments like harpsichords, pianos, organs, guitars, violins, and, of course, books and newspapers, including the complete set of Churchill's voyages, adorned with copper plates and 8 volumes folio, among others. Now, if you glance through the archives of the Calcutta Gazette, these advertisements are, it's not just a isolated advertisement, there are countless of these. There are also references to auctions off, among other things, books, bookshelves, study tables, and other material objects associated with reading and writing, paper, um, right, from the collections of Europeans when they either pass away or depart from India or simply sell off their things. Books, much like any other consumer product of the empire, occupied a pride of place in such elegant collections, signifying taste, sophistication, and class. The first steamboats would arrive in Calcutta in the 1820s. Prior to that, in particular, these advertisements were all too necessary to tell discerning readers of books about the arrival of precious cargo all the way from Europe. By the end of the 18th century, colonial Calcutta uh, was a rapidly growing city, uh, far outpacing the growth of other British presidencies in Bombay and Madras. Though again, it's really, in comparison, these are also major cities emerging, and Bombay would eventually overtake Calcutta in terms of industrial growth. But that's another 100 years later. The growing European population of the city found the need to maintain luxurious standard of living, amply assisted by the cheap availability of Indian labor, as well as enterprising European retailers who set up shop in the city. So you had European retailers confined around what's the Tank Square area, with an offshoot into the Lal Bazaar area. And while the majority of the European owned business was tied to wholesaling, the retailers made a lot of money. So you have Emma Roberts' account of European retailers in 1837, where she talks about the large and handsome jewelry shops, the magnificent establishment that was Thacker and Co., the city's main bookseller, and at least half a dozen French and English milliners, that is to say, hat sellers. Numerous wholesalers included emporiums, which held regular auctions of imported porcelain from France, glittering over with gold and flowered patterns, as well as many other fancy stuff. So there was a considerable market of art prints as well. And the English retailers, of course, did not simply cater to the European population, but to the native elite as well. As Christopher Bailey has pointed out, European traders in the late Mughal period breached Oriental patterns of consumption by catering to the insatiable desire of India's rulers for novelties, which would lead to the establishment of trade routes and commercial connections for the sale of clocks, china menageries, mirrors, elaborate embroidery, which were later adapted to supply aristocratic taste in cloth and finally help create a mass demand for imported textiles. Such novelties represented the ruler's powers. Just think, for instance, of Lucknow, their connections with realms far and wide. The expansion of the British East India Company's business in India in the late 18th and the early 19th centuries meant, furthermore, a substantial shift in the material culture of the Indian elite, even as sections of the existing aristocracy found itself in decline and a newer elite, often aligned with the company, emerged. Toru Dutt and her family was very much a part of this new elite, aligned with the East India Company. The conspicuous consumption of the colonial bourgeoisie marked a carefully cultivated expression of luxury, not unlike that of the pre colonial ruling classes. The possession and display of a previously unknown range of household goods, alongside the massive English style mansions of the city, serve to represent their place in the changing structures of power in colonial India. The Dutts, allow me to remind you, held a very held a very large garden house in the outskirts of Calcutta, in a place that is called Bagmari. And Torudat writes about this frequently. It's present in a lot of her writing, in famous poems uh, uh, like Shashwat is. I've switched off my screen, so since it's just a static slide, I felt it's no longer necessary. So if I can go back to this again. Um, Served to Torudat's family again is very much a part of this colonial elite, and that furthermore that we, there apart from their town house in Maniktola, they also held a massive garden house in Bagmari, which we read about in poems like Our Cashew in a Tree, for example, which most students of English literature would be familiar with. In a polemical essay, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, the essay is called Confessions of a Young Bengal. He writes, "The stamp of the Anglo Saxon foreigner is upon our houses, our furniture, our carriages." Um, I'm sorry, just a minute, yes. Our carriages, our food, our drink, our dress, our very familiar letters and conversation, chairs, tables, pankhas, seldom meant to be pulled, American clocks, glassware of variegated hues, pictures for which the illustrated London news is liberally laid under contribution. Incidentally, Torudat's family does read the illustrated London news. There are references to it. Kerosene lamps, bookshelves filled with Reynolds' mysteries, Tom Paine's Age of Reason, and the complete poetical works of Lord Byron, English musical boxes, compose the fashionable furniture of the sitting rooms of young Bengal. The ubiquitous products of the empire, especially among this, the printed book, touch upon the lives of the Babus. They make their presence felt in the ostentatious display of the drawing rooms of the household and penetrate the lives of the women in the Andarmahal, who, for all their differences in the construction and the decor of the Babu's drawing room and the inner rooms, nonetheless are not exempt from interaction with these objects. It is not, of course, simply European books that were available in the bookish marketplace in 19th century Bengal. Far from its somber beginnings at the Srirampur Mission Press in 1800, with the publication of of the Bengali New Testament, the world of vernacular print by 1889 had expanded to include a robust trade in, among other things, cheaply produced and marketed books. Very often, sensational novels and obscene farces, the low and the unseemly other of modern Bengali literature, censured and ridiculed by the reformist press, led by respectable journals like Bongodarshan, Som Prakash, and Sadharani. Women's patronage of the Bengali print industry, especially the much maligned chapbooks and novels, and other such women's genres as Anindita Ghosh calls them, in many ways shaped popular literary tastes and book production. At the same time, however, it led to fears of contamination, as Shapan Chakraborty puts it, and leads to howls of anxiety over the purported idleness of the woman reader in the Bengali household. In the upper caste Hindu households, the Bhadro households in particular. Let me give you an example. So there's this anonymous pamphlet titled Novel Heroine. Uh, It's a play on the word novel and new, of course. It explicitly frames the modern woman's consumption of books, the popular romantic novel to be precise, as the source of both social and financial decline, as Horodev The long suffering husband of the novel crazed heroine Rukmini urges the imagined male audience slash reader, spending your hard earned money and encouraging this mad craze for useless romances, please do not make beasts out of human beings. So the woman reader is potentially a beast in the making. The printed book, as one of the many luxuries afforded by the consumer economy of the colonial city, becomes representative of women's consuming habits, suspicious and dangerous for the erotic excess they represent, and the easy association of the consuming wife with the figure of the Kamini, whose place in the city of spectacles is as an object of consumption, as the nautch girl or the prostitute or the actress in the public theatre. The book makes its way into the Anurmahol, the inner domain, by virtue of its ubiquity and it's the increasing expansion of women's education. Advice literature for women at this time inserts itself in this overwhelming concern over women's practices of consumption time and again, beginning with the book and extending itself to food and objects of luxury. So you keep hearing cautionary tales of passive consumption, which warn women of the vice of idleness, even as there appears the haunting image of the body that is idle, sitting in an armchair and weaving a carpet, or reading the Meghnad Kabbo, lying in a bed reading a newspaper, while, of course, avoiding her domestic responsibilities. So it is in this context of anxiety and hyperbole over women's reading practices in particular that the question of leisurely reading and fear of idleness as a feminine sin that we approach Toru Dutt's letters to Mary Martin. In a letter written in September 1875, Toru writes to Mary Martin, "We lead a quiet life here, and so I have very little news to give you." Toru describes a life of leisure, one where she either takes up a book or plays for a quarter of an hour with the kittens, and Papa, that is to say Govind Chandra Dutt, reads or writes or pores over the Indian daily news. After lunch at noon, Toru reads or writes till 3, after which she goes out on a drive in her horse carriage with her beloved horses, Gentile and Jonette. A letter from October 1876 explains, "The reason I can go through a book so fast is plain and simple. It is simply owing to our quiet and retired mode of life. The time we would have had to give to lunch, to dinner, to breakfast, to croquet, to lawn tennis or picnic parties, it is wholly given up to reading, and then I was always a bookworm, even when I was a child." She also assures Mary Martin that she is not above reading novels. In fact, she said that I'm reading La Miserable by Victor Hugo as we speak. On November 30, 1876, Toru writes another letter. "You know, I sit out every afternoon in my uncle's garden. This is at a time when she is physically at her weakest, her health deteriorating fatally with every passing day. I suppose I look very contented and absorbed, reading Love Miserable and having my cats, Day and May, frisking about me, for Papa has made a couplet on the subject." Ramesh Chandra Dutt, the family historian, informs us that Govind Dutt left his high appointment at the accounts department under the government of India for a life where he, I quote, devoted his leisure in retirement to literature and to religious studies. There was a good collection of choice books in the house. For study was Govind Chandra's only recreation. Again, note the emphasis on choice books indicating taste. In fact, he tells us, literary work and religious studies were still the sole occupation of Govind Chandra and his family during their stay in Europe. Govind's collection of choice books, as we gather, is a practice he inherits from his father, Roshomoy Datta, who had a rare and choice collection of English books and created in his children that remarkable devotion to English literature that distinguishes the family. Now, building such a rare collection of books would have come at a considerable cost, especially prior to the arrival of the steamship in Calcutta, which only arrives in the 1820s. It is also a habit that occupies most of Toru Dutt's life, as she speaks of borrowing books and magazines from the Calcutta Public Library, buying books from the city's ample stores, as well as itinerant peddlers, hawkers who would travel around with books, as well as importing books from London via Hachette, the French publishing giant. The books imported from London, of course, were mostly French books. So let me give you a couple of examples. She talks about a book by Arkman Chatrian, and please forgive my French pronunciation, I'm not very good at it. It's the Histoire d'un paysan. She says it's very interesting and relates to the revolution of 1792. She talks about history of the French Revolution. This is an English book by Carlyle. She says it is very interesting, and I'm sure you will like it when you come to read it. She's writing to Mary Martin. She talks about a book called The Souvenir, Down Voyage. It is very interesting. I have not read it myself, but Papa has and likes it very much. One assumes she will also read it shortly. She talks about uh, her father, we are told, is a shareholder at the Calcutta Public Library. The library's holdings of French books are a joy to Toru and her father. For instance, with reference to another novel by Victor Hugo, she writes, I had written several times for it from the Calcutta Public Library, but the invariable answer had always been out, sorry to say. But the librarian got tired of my perseverance, and I have received the book at last. It is much inferior to La Châtiment's. A particular favorite is a literary magazine, Revue des Deux Mondes, which is a French language monthly literary, cultural, and current affairs magazine that has been published in France, in Paris since 1829, and it continues to be in publication. Much of their orders of the French books from Hachette, which has been the matter of intense, discussion in a lot of Toru that scholarship, that the fact that she not only reads English but also French. Much of their orders of the French books from Hachette via London appear to be based on reviews in this magazine. For instance, Marmier's Les Fiancés du Spitzberry is ordered by Govind Chandar because it received the Académie Francaise Award. Toru, who reads the book, tells us that it is very interesting and a nice book. She also tells us that I go on reading from La Revue des Deux Mondes. They afford to me a vast field of amusement and instruction, and the subjects in each number are so varied. Political questions, social questions, geological, literary, theatrical, and all subjects of interest are discussed and set forth clearly before the reader. In fact, this magazine is referred to in almost each and every letter of hers. I was lately reading an article on Voltaire and Shakespeare, and another very interesting one about Sergeant Hoff, who figured in the last war. The Hachette orders from Calcutta, they normally take, from what we gather from the letters, that they did normally take about 2 months to arrive, though sometimes the deliveries are take more time. Her uncle also imports German language books from them. Sometimes, if they have a balance with the publisher, Hachette sends books that they think the Dutts will like. So Toru often talks about book reviews published in the magazine, even if she hasn't read them herself. And she speaks often in juxtaposition of the Bengal magazine published by Reverend Lal Bihari De and her contributions therein. It's almost as though she imagines a similar magazine that she might have some contribution towards. Toru is also conscious of the material aspects of the book, as befits an avid book collector. For example, she describes a volume by Madame de Witt. It's called The Scenes Historiques, and she tells us that it is a beautifully and richly bound volume with illustrations. Her father gives her a volume of Mrs. Barrett Browning's poems on her birthday, and again she tells us that it's a beautiful volume. She has a copy of a book called An Illustrated Horse Doctor. She was very interested in this, especially with regards to her own horses. And she talks about the fact that this is a book with beautiful, large colored illustrations. The Dutts also, by all account, read a lot of newspapers. Apart from looking at various newspapers that do that offer reviews of Toru's book, first book, The Sheaf Gleaned in French Fields, they seem to be a daily subscriber of the Indian Daily News. The Illustrated London News is also referred to, though I'm not sure if they subscribe to it or if they borrow it from the CPL. Now, Toru is a discerning reader. She has a lot of commentary to offer. For instance, she reads a book called La Gentle Home Pour by Henry Conscience, which was recommended by Moshe Gerard, the French master at St. Leonard's. She says the book is sentimental, dull, and worthless. Another book, also recommended by the same gentleman, he says it's good in its way, but meant more for children than adults. She reads another novel, another book called Germain by Moshe About, and she says it's very readable but not very moral. Jane Eyre gets a fantastic review, though not the moral is not very high, for the authoress favors bigamy. The work is written with a masterly power and shows a gift of discerning characters, which is wonderful in a woman. If you once commence with the book, you will not be able to sleep unless you finish it. Now, I could, of course, go on talking about her books, but there's a very large list of it. But what is to be noted is that she speaks matter of factly of her retired, quiet life, devoted to reading, a life that allows, in material terms, a garden house in Bagmari, a townhouse in Maniktola, horses, trips to Europe, important books, and so on. Despite Govindath quitting his very lucrative position with the government of India, in fact, in one letter, she assures Mary Martin that she is in fact very rich. And this is how she describes her writing space. The room, library as we call it, for it is furnished with six almirahs or glass shelves of books, in which I am writing. It has only two windows, which makes it rather dark on a cloudy day. It has four doors. Two have been shut up by the two bookshelves, and two are open. One leads to our dining room in the east, and the other is the door of the exit. We are rather hard up here for rooms. There is no regular drawing room. The old Bagmari is much more comfortable with its sunny rooms and halls. Elsewhere, she describes her bedroom, decorated in half a Bengali, half English style. And again, it boasts of a small desk at one corner, covered with sundry English, French, and Bengali and Sanskrit books. One might contrast this space, the dedicated library, as well as the desk that she has to herself in her bedroom. One might contrast this with Rashundari Dashi's commentary on the difficulty that writing posed for her, because that required a lot of additional things, which is the pen, the paper, the ink, that would make it visible and cumbersome. We can think of the fact that Rashundari's if space for her room of her own was her kitchen late in the night. Such difficulties or such hurdles do not seem to be particularly of concern for Toru Dutt. In fact, for her, idleness instead, far from the horrors of the expected in the advice manuals of the time about women who are idle because they're reading novels. Toru Dutt defines idleness as a state of not indulging in leisurely reading. In fact, in a letter, she says, I have not read anything lately. Since my last illness, I have got to be very idle, I think. A whole month passed in laziness in bed is very bad, and apt to make one idle and good for nothing, even when one is strong and well again. It's a very odd definition of idleness, sharply in contrast to the general definitions of what it means for a woman to be idle. This places her in a rather unique location in comparison to most Bengali women readers of her time, even those with comparable social standing, say such as Swarnakumari Devi, Rabindranath Tagore's eldest sister, and a novelist and an editor in her own right, or a Begum Rokeya Shakhawat Hussain, who often in her letters complains about having no time at all to read. It is similarly noteworthy that Toru almost refers to no Bengali books in her letters. The only reference point to anything Bengali is uh, when she speaks of her desk, which appears to have books in Bengali. What did she read in Bengali, if she did at all? Was it only serious writing? Did she read novels in Bengali? Did the hawkers who came along with books to her house only give her these leather bound volumes in English, or did they also supply the cheaply produced chapbooks from the Bortola printers? I have my doubts about the latter. Even though Toru leaves us in the dark, it is possible that reading in Bengali was not very high on Toru's list of priorities. Her French and English learning placing her on a very different location that her from her contemporaries who mostly patronized the thriving Bengali print market. Meenakshi Mukherjee, in an essay about Toru Dutt, talks about Toru's Bengaliness, especially in reference to the last volume of her works and her use of local folklore, such as in a poem like Jogadda Uma. But despite her assertions, we know that Toru had listened to the story from someone in her family. It's not something that she had read herself, and that furthermore, Toru often, while she is of course learning Sanskrit and at times reading Shakuntala in Sanskrit, she does not she her interaction with a lot of Indian sources is also through French and English books. So, while one cannot find fault in Meenakshi Mukherjee's statement that Toru Dutt is a Bengali author, she's a certain kind of Bengali author and a certain kind of Bengali reader, a product of the very specific circumstances of 19th century Calcutta and its elites' interactions with the English language, with access to books, with access to formal education, and certain things that they held as significant. Part of this, of course, can be attributed to the Dutts' relative isolation from Calcutta society, beyond a few family members and the small Christian community in the city. Now, again, this is something Toru Dutt's Christianity is often erased in discussions of her poetry. This was, in fact, erased in her lifetime itself. A lot of the reviews of a sheaf gleaned in French fields talks about her as this pure Hindu blooded figure. It's very orientalizing, but it also erases the circumstances of her reading and her writing, because the ostracism that the Dutts experienced after their conversion to Christianity meant that Toru could socialize with only a very few people in Calcutta. To say nothing, of course, of her poor health. She speaks about this, in fact, about the questions that she faced about not being married, about not having children, about feeling very different from most young men and most young women of her age who would have been already married and with at least two, three children, if not more. She, at 21, is unable to interact even with her sisters in law from the Hindu side of the family because, again, she has nothing in common with them. She talks about the discomfort with Calcutta society, often in very disparaging terms, and the lack of freedom to go on walks as she did in England. The only freedom that she appears to have of this sort is in the very sequestered space of the Bagmari garden house, where, of course, she can roam around as she wishes, where she rides her horse as she pleases. While their wealth, and it is wealth that allows her that Bagmari space in the first place, their wealth certainly allowed the retirement and life of leisure that most Bengali Bhadramohila could scarcely imagine. A life of leisure, a part of this was not by choice. In many ways, Torudat appears to be attempting to construct a republic of letters through reaching out to Mary Martin, to her readers in the Bengal magazine, to her other correspondents, exchanging books and book reviews, creating a broader community centered around the written word, even as she finds herself unable to escape the physical space of Calcutta. And there's another set of complexities there which we don't really have a space to discuss. She speaks about going back to England often, even though it's something that doesn't happen. Central to this whole endeavor of reading, of finding a certain community of readers, central to this whole thing is her father, who is by all accounts her closest companion and her intellectual mentor, especially after the death of Orudat. She tells Mary Martin how nice it would be if they could read together in England again, that is to say, Toru and Mary together. She says that Papa and I often read together. Before I got my cough, and she's talking about tuberculosis, of course, we used to read aloud to each other by turns from any French book. Papa is a great authority on poetry. Now, of evenings, as we do not read much by candlelight, we repeat together pieces of poetry, English or French, or else it is a stray Sanskrit line. Elsewhere, she again writes, Papa and I, without Papa, I should have never known good poetry from bad. He used to take such pains with us when we were quite little ones. He has himself a most discriminating mind and is an excellent judge of poetry. He commenced reading poetry before he was 12. Quite the genius, clearly. And do you know, he left school at the age of 14 and commenced business before he was 17. Without Papa, we should have never learned to appreciate good books and good poetry. In their days of leisure in Bagmadi and in the townhouse in Maniktola, Toru Dutt and Govind Chandra Dutt appear to have formed a small community of readers, a club of two, with Toru's mother making occasional appearances, gifting books to his ailing daughter, publishing her writing, indulging in reading together and reading aloud. In many upper caste Hindu households, reading together and reading aloud would form an important part of female sociability. But Toru, cut off from most women in Calcutta, did not have other women to read with. She only had her father, and until her very last day, he was the company that she kept. Even after her death, he is the one editing and publishing what remains of her writing. I'm coming to an end now. I think I've spoken long enough. To look at Toru Dutt and the Dutt family at large as readers, then, is to look at an elite household that is at once unique and typical of Calcutta's literate elite at the time. It is unique in its sequestered, isolated location, in particular its separation from broader Hindu and Brahmo society, as well as a relative lack of interaction with Muslim elite of comparable social status. It is characteristic in its patterns of consumption, in its fetishization of book ownership as a hallmark of taste and culture, something that is passed on generationally from Rashomoy Datto to Govind Datto to Toru Datto, in its building of a generational collection of books in multiple languages, including imported books that were spoken of with some esteem. As we see, his collection of books is something, Rashomoy Datto's collection of books is something that's spoken of in its patronization of an institution like the Calcutta Public Library, even as it did not fail to buy books from the humble hawkers who roamed the city by foot. Toru Dutt, the reader, is defined by her leisure to read, to claim to have a room of her own at a time when it was near impossible for most Bengali women to claim something even close to similar. Far from leisured reading being an idle practice for Toru, it is her lack of reading on occasion that gets characterized as idleness. And this contrast, of course, with other Bengali women of her time, raises questions about access, raises questions about leisure, raises questions about domestic spaces in Bengali households. But that, of course, is subject for another time. I will draw my presentation to a close here and thank you very much for giving me an audience.
Thank, thank you so much, Swati, for that enriching talk, for that extremely enlightening and interactive. You kept us engrossed all the while and told us things about Toru Dutt that we usually don't seem to care about. I mean, I'm sure that students all over India do read Toru Dutt's poetry. She's a familiar figure, as you rightly pointed out, but to look at the idea of or the figure of the ideal reader, as you mentioned in the title, and to draw attention to its different connotations, the way a new sort of elite class was shaped through certain practices of reading and the uniqueness of the Dutt family, even within the larger community of elites, as something completely new. And we are grateful to you for that wonderful presentation. Now, maybe take a few questions. Is that okay?
Of course, yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, great. Um, So I think I have one question here with me. It's not in the chat box, but there are students who want to know about the method and your access to archives. Could you please tell us a little bit about how you managed to find the materials and how you managed to work on this particular topic? A little bit on the sources and the method.
Right. In this particular case, again, as you know, the libraries are closed, and I haven't been able to visit the National Library at all. They've just reopened it. When I started working on this earlier this year at around February, I was beginning to think about going to the National Library because it had reopened. Then it shut down again, and so there has been no physical archive visiting. Though eventually, I think I will have to go there. It's close. It's not very far away from where I am, so I do have that physical access as and when it's available. But apart from that, apart from the physical access to the library, I have benefited immensely from the digital archives maintained on websites like archive.org, which more or less has almost every primary text that I was looking at, including the letters of Toru Dutt, which was of most significance to me. I also refer to that are maintained by the Cross Asia Repository. It's in collaboration between the Center for the Study of Social Sciences, Calcutta, and the University of Heidelberg, and a number of they have a number of um, uh, uh, periodicals that they have made available, and they are particularly I refer to the Probashi and to the Boshantok. I couldn't really mention them here because but for my larger project, which this is a small part of, those archives have been immensely useful to me, which I'll also recommend students. If when you're looking for primary sources, do take a look at archive, do take a look at the Cross Asia Repository, do take a look at um, resources that I cannot name because they are not necessarily legal, but they are nonetheless very important in the kind of work that we do at times. So it's a combination of both legally obtainable as well as not so legal archives that I have managed to get hold of these materials. I hope that answers your question, Shashwat.
Yes, yes. Thanks so much for that. We have one more question. Uh, thank you, Professor Moitra, for that engaging lecture. Could you tell us a little bit about women book peddlers making their way into elite households with respect
Yes.
to Toru Dutt? I think there's a different talk on that, but yeah, but
Yes, I have spoken about this at length, and I could go on for another 40 minutes. I won't. But I find the women peddlers absolutely fascinating, and the peddlers in general fascinating because it's this system of home delivery, right? This is a time when you don't have a lot of course, you have the Thacker and Co., a few other physical bookstores catering to Europeans in particular. You also have school bookstores that operate around the College Street area. But that's not the main way that people are accessing books. People are accessing books through subscriptions, through the circulation libraries, and of course, through these peddlers who carry books everywhere. Now, you have male peddlers and female peddlers. Now, Toru, that doesn't mention the gender of the peddlers she has encountered. So I cannot really tell. But with regards from we get this from a number of other women's narratives that women peddlers in particular, again from certain caste groups which had access to the upper caste households, at least at least the inner courtyard, if nothing else. It's women from these caste groups in particular who would take up this profession because of their access. So it's a certain kind of targeted delivery, again, negotiating with the norms of caste and creating new professional structures. So these women booksellers, they would, and they were not necessarily booksellers alone, they also sold other stuff. So they would show up, they would carry it in their heads, and with a large basket, wicker basket usually, and they would show up in these households usually in the afternoon, and women would gather around the books and they would of course haggle and buy. So a lot of the popular genres, the novels, the chapbooks of all sorts. These are being sneaked into the households through these resources. In fact, women don't mention, they're very, we got this book, they don't mention reading pornography or any such thing, though it did exist. So but overall, of the women peddlers and their intimate access to the domestic sphere made possible this kind of targeted selling, which I think is a fascinating business model to think about.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. I think since we have already started talking about your other work, so we might as well venture a little further into it, and maybe not so much in terms of subject, but in terms of methods and techniques. So I think on separate occasion you have talked about the use of technology in doing book history, and if I'm not mistaken, you have spoken about the use of GIS. Uh,
Yes,
so
I
so
have.
could you please tell us a little bit about that? I think our students
Yes,
will,
I
in
cannot
particular,
claim to
will
be
find it very useful.
I cannot claim to be an expert here, Flashwath, because again, this is also something very new for me. I have been exploring because I think, and this is something that digital humanists speak a lot better on. I'm only, again, this is something I started exploring early last year. So I cannot claim to be an expert under any circumstances. But what I found was that the use of GIS in particular, and again, nothing complicated really, using story maps and such, it helped me visualize certain things which uh, sometimes it's simply considering something textually does not necessarily help you understand in a way that a visualization process does. For instance, I'll give you an example. Earlier this year I was working on a paper on the Sanskrit press, Vishwachandra Vidyasagar, and I wanted to take. I had made certain assumptions about why Vidyasagar had moved to that area with his press in the first place. But what I started doing was then using the story maps feature to using GIS to plot the locations of the printing presses in the College Street area, which there was not the dominant it was not the neighborhood of books that it is today. Far from it. It was an outlier. It was the Chitpur Goranhata area that sold that the Ashoba Bazaar area that had more of the publishing presses. But I had made certain assumptions, but as I started plotting them, and again drawing upon the very good bibliographical work of Ashish Khastogir and others, I found that I had made certain assumptions about the location which were incorrect, and I had to change my hypothesis somewhat. But it was this visualization tool that allowed me to do this. Um, this is primarily the use that I have had so far. I've also, for instance, I've used it elsewhere to plot the journey of printing around the in cities across the Gangetic heartland in another presentation last year. So this is what I have been trying to explore. Of course, this is only uh, not this is really the tip of the iceberg, because book historians have been using digital methods for a very long time. For instance, my own work here in this very presentation, where I was looking at the books that Toru that talks about in her letters, using digital methods to tabulate and to generate data about this large set of books mentioned in this piece, or even something that the PDF that I have is not a scannable PDF. So the Jadavpur University's Bichitra project, for instance, ensures that their Tagore archives are scannable and searchable. I kept thinking how nice it would be if I could make a searchable archive out of it. Of course, I lack the technological skills, but again, I think there is an immense potential here that of which I know very little. But yes, I think I'd like to keep exploring it more in my life, as I progress with my work. And I think it's very interesting that There is a lot more work in digital humanities going on. IIT Jodhpur is now offering courses on it. I know fellow scholars working very seriously in this domain. So, from my own perspective as a big book historian, I would like to explore the possibilities presented here as well.
All right. We have one more question, and this is from our student, a former student, Amrit, who's keen on finding out what were Toru the sources of influence. I mean, does she mention any writer or writers who influenced her writing? Does she talk
I
about
think
any? Uh,
she's a voracious reader, and her influences are diverse. You can very clearly see the influences of the romantic poets. She is a reader of. She directly cites Wordsworth in places. Wordsworth, Keats, Milton. These are very important influences in her poetry. Also, to an extent, I think both the poetry of her father as well as that of William Jones shows some influence. Um, she's also a voracious reader of French, and in her French writing, at least, you can see again influence of the contemporary writers that she speaks highly of. So yes, she's drawing from a lot of sources because again she reads so much.
Uh, Thank you so much, Dr. Moitra, for not only responding to that question, but all the queries and for that wonderful presentation. We're thankful to you, thankful because you found time for us and for the presentation from which we've had so much to learn, and hopefully our students will draw inspiration from your work, and hopefully they too will try to carry out some exercise in book history, print culture, and so on. And of course, our best wishes to you with your project, which we hope to read whenever it is out. That is. Thank you so much,
Thank you
and
so much.
I would
Thank
like
you
to
so
thank
much.
our viewers for joining us today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.